So in this next section, I'm going to talk about corporate strategy for the most part, right? We're talking about making sure that our projects, our IS projects, are aligned with our corporate strategy. There's no point in doing projects if they don't have some direct alignment to the strategy, the overall strategy of the organization. By the way, when I say corporate, really this could be anything, right? It could be government, it could be manufacturing, it could be a traditional company, it could be a consulting, it doesn't matter, right? But we have to make sure that these projects are meeting the core needs of the organization. So to benefit from a planning-based approach, we want to make sure we analyze all of its information needs thoroughly and that we plan project very carefully, plan which projects and how we're going to do those projects very carefully to make sure that they're going to meet the needs of the organization. Why is this so critical? 40%, according to our book, if you're following along in Modern Systems Analysis and Design by Valachik and George, 8th edition, 40% of organizational expenses, according to that textbook. I don't recall what their citation was for that statistic, but information systems costs are expensive and they're going up, right? They have gone up over the last 30 years. Businesses, it used to be a much smaller portion of their overall operating expenses, but today it's a much larger percentage. So we have a lack of cross-organizational applications and systems. Again, in larger organizations, information system development used to be keyed into these very localized usages of these systems or just to specific areas, functional areas. But now, with information systems, it makes a lot more sense to try to make sure we're meeting the needs of the entire organization and that we're crossing these functional barriers cross through the organization. So different departments can utilize the same functionality. For example, you might have one department that bills their customers and another department that bills other customers. And they might have their own billing systems. But gosh, wouldn't it make a lot of sense if we were on one unified platform for doing all of our accounts receivable across the organization? We can consolidate some of that work. So it would make a lot of sense. Systems should not address critical strategic problems. Or should they, one of the problems is that we might have projects that get implemented that are not addressing core or critical strategic problems. They're just being implemented just because, right? Too much data redundancy or a lack of data quality could be another reason that we need this improved planning. System maintenance costs are obviously getting high as well, along with the cost to acquire information systems, long application backlogs, and so forth. So corporate strategic planning is an ongoing process. So it's going to define a mission along with objectives and strategies of the organization. So it's always going to start with a mission statement, which I'll talk about in just a minute, followed by an objective or a list of objectives for the organization, and a description of the competitive strategy, and I'll talk about what those are. But let's start with a mission statement. So a mission statement is basically a statement that is just a clear declaration of what business the company is in. What do we do? What is our reason for being here, right? I work in healthcare. So most mission statements of most hospitals, their mission is to provide healthcare to the community or to provide healing to the community. Now they'll come up with different words to describe it, but they're basically saying, why are we here? Why do we exist? What value do we bring? And if you're in a business that can't answer that question, if you're in a business that doesn't have a mission, that's probably not going to be in a successful business. So it's important to have a very clear mission statement. Everybody knows why we're here and what we're doing. Then we have our objective statement, which is a series of statements that's going to express the organization's qualitative and quantitative goals for reaching a desired future position. So how are we getting there? How are we going to meet this overall mission statement? Here's an example. In the Modern Systems Analysis book, if you're following along, 8th edition by Valachik and George, this is the example for Pine Valley Furniture, which is a running case study throughout that textbook. And Pine Valley Furniture has 5 objective statements, right? These 5 objectives. This is how they're going to meet that objective. They're going to strive to increase their market share and profitability. They're going to be, they want to be considered a market leader. They're going to be innovative in their use of technology to bring new markets to, or new products to market faster than their competition, right? So this is how they're going to meet that mission. This is what they're going to do to stay competitive. Now, a competitive strategy, there's really, I think, 3 main types of competitive strategy. You have low-cost producer, which, if you think in the United States about Walmart, that's an example of a low-cost market, right? The value that Walmart brings to the market is that they have everything cheaper than everyone else, right? They may not have the best customer service and they may not have the best products, but you can be pretty sure that they're going to be the cheapest products, right? Um, Product differentiation is another way to, is another competitive strategy where you say, well, we're not going to be the cheapest company, but we're going to be the best, right? We're going to have the best product that you can buy. So maybe you can get it cheaper at Walmart, but we're going to bring something else to that market. Take for example, every Walmart has a photo studio, right? They have a little shop where you can, a little area where they can take pictures for you. Not every Walmart has them, but let's say they have a photo studio in Walmart. It's probably going to be the cheapest place you can go to get photos of your family. But if you go to a photo studio somewhere in town, they're going to be more expensive, but chances are they're going to produce a better product. So that's their differentiation. They have a better product than their competitors, so they can charge more. I'm going to pay more for a higher quality product. And then the third one is focusing on a niche. So first we have low cost, then we could be differentiator, but then we could also service a niche. Basically what a niche means is I don't have competition. I'm in a market that is so small or so niche, no one else is doing what I'm doing. So either I'm doing it for cheaper than everyone else, I'm doing it better than everyone else, or I'm doing something that no one else is doing. That's the basic three corporate strategies, the basic three strategies that you can have for competition. Either do it cheaper, better, or be the only one that does it. And those are the three ways. Pretty much all strategies come down to those three. And this is from the textbook from Valachik and George's textbook, Modern Systems Analysis and Design, 8th edition. There's a little table in there that they have where they compare these different competitive strategies that I just talked about. So with information systems planning, basically what is information systems planning? It's an orderly means of assessing information needs and defining systems, databases, and technologies that will meet those needs. So what we're doing with formal information systems planning is we're making sure that we understand what our needs are, and we're defining what those needs are, and we're defining and we're describing technologies and systems that can meet those needs. What can we do? And we're trying to enumerate exactly how that's going to meet our mission, how that's going to meet our objectives, and how that fits into our competitive strategy. So, and a good example here is if your competitive strategy is to be the low-cost provider, right? Why would you want to implement an information system that's all about providing better quality, right? That maybe that's, quality's good, don't get me wrong, but why would you go the extra mile for quality assurance if that's not your market, if that's not what you do? Like take Walmart, for example. They're not known for putting out quality products. They're known for putting out products that are very inexpensive. And they would not have much need for being, say, an ISO 9000 quality, organization. It wouldn't give them any competitive advantage. As a Walmart customer, it wouldn't matter to me that Walmart, I don't care that Walmart has some quality certification. What matters to me is that they're cheap. Whereas if I'm going to a pharmacy, maybe I am more concerned about them having a certified quality assurance system in place to ensure that level of quality that I would expect from a pharmacy. And of course, different business units could also implement this a little bit different. So these activities can all happen in parallel. So when we're looking at the current enterprise, we're looking at our current situation, taking stock of our current situation. What do we have right now? Our future enterprise is we're trying to determine what is, learn as much as we can about the organization so that we can determine what we want in the future, what we see in the future that's going to meet that strategy and that mission statement I talked about. And then finally, the strategic plan is where we're actually scheduling these projects in a meaningful way, and we know that we have the resources, we have the budget, and that we're putting that budget and those resources to the best possible use to meet those goals. So top-down planning, and we talked about this in the previous slide deck, right? So I talked about top-down versus bottom-up. So top-down planning is generally very broad. It's usually started by management, so of course it's going to have a lot of management support. and better understanding from management and the organization as a whole, because it usually covers an enterprise. Then I talked about bottom-up planning, which is generally for smaller projects or usually bubbling up from the bottom, which I talked about before. So you can infer from that that bottom-up projects are generally less costly and they're much more nimble. They can happen much faster because they're smaller projects. So again, there's that top-down and that bottom-up planning that could happen. So when we're doing information systems planning, one of the techniques that makes a lot of sense is something called functional decomposition. And functional decomposition is when you look at the overall function that you are trying to design or plan for, and you try to decompose that. You try to break it into smaller pieces. And by breaking things into smaller pieces, it makes it easier to analyze those pieces. We're going to talk much more detail later on about functional decomposition when we look at systems analysis and systems design in the next part of this topic, but this course and this set of slide decks. But basically, we want to take that whole big picture that we're talking about. Remember, this information systems planning is looking at the big picture, the whole enterprise. Now that we get an idea of the big picture, we need to decompose that into its smaller pieces. So we're going to decompose into smaller pieces, smaller bite-sized pieces that we can analyze and understand at an individual level. And then once we do that, so once we break everything down, then we can do things like planning matrices. So a planning matrice is where we take all this functional decomposition. We take all the different, we might break down what are our locations, what do those locations do, what business units do they operate in, what's the core functionality, how are they contributing to that mission and those objectives that we talked about in the beginning of this slide deck, right? So we're going to take all of that stuff and we're going to plot that onto a matrix that looks something like this. Now, when you put this on the matrix on the entity to function matrix here that you see in this example, which again is from Modern Systems Analysis and Design by Valachik and George, 8th edition, you can start to see things kind of clustering here, right? And that's the next piece, is that once we do this functional decomposition, right? So we do our functional decomposition to break everything down into bite-sized pieces. Then we do our matrix to see, how, what exactly everyone is doing and where, right? So we kind of, it's sort of a two-dimensional look at all of these different functions and how they use these systems. And once we see these patterns evolve, that leads us into, sorry, let me skip this slide here. Once we see those patterns evolve, that leads us into affinity clustering. So we can look at those patterns, and affinity clustering is basically the extent to which information holds things in common. That's what affinity means. So what you're looking for is commonalities in these different functions that you've decomposed. And then once you have those commonalities, it can help you develop plans for systems that cross those functional boundaries. So, or those organizational boundaries rather, not so much the functional boundaries. So, in the beginning I talked about that example. Let's come full circle back to my example in the beginning. I talked about how you might have one system for billing in one department and a different system for doing billing and accounts receivable in a different department. Well, what we could identify with this whole process, and this is just one example, right? But if we do our functional decomposition, we see that one of the functions we discover is accounts receivable. And the places that we see that are in Department A, Department B, Department C, and Department D, right? We put that on that matrix, but then we see this clustering. We see, oh, look at that. All 5 of these departments use this function that we've decomposed. So now that I know that, with affinity clustering, I'm identifying that through that matrix that we created earlier. I've identified that need. Now I can say, well, one way I could build efficiency into my into my core information systems delivery is by having a common platform for accounts receivable and integrate to these other platforms, right? So we have one common platform, so we could, maybe the accounting department could now use that to be able to have visibility, sort of an aggregated visibility of everything happening in the organization. Goodness, wouldn't that give us a lot of, that would really contribute to our mission, it would contribute to our strategy, right? We can find a way to justify something like that. But that's something we can recognize. Now, one thing you might be saying to yourself right now is that if you're in a business, a lot of this is obvious, right? Well, gee, Brian, isn't it obvious that that if you have 5 different departments using different billing systems, that they should all be in a unified platform? And I would say, yes, that is obvious when you put it that way. But this is an obvious example, and sometimes these examples are not obvious. Sometimes the things that you find by going through this formalized process, are less obvious. But the other thing I want to mention too is this isn't just about, doing all this stuff on paper. You may never do this on paper. You may never make yourself a matrix. You may never do a functional decomposition. But what I'd like you to think about is a way of thinking through these things, right? So I'm trying to maybe give you a way to think about how we can break down, how we can look at a large organization as a systems analyst or as an auditor or anybody in these information systems roles at this level. You're going to be tasked with looking at the overall organization, right? Looking at the whole organization, and you have to decompose, you have to deconstruct in your head, how does this organization work? How does all this stuff fit together? And then you might start to kind of see these commonalities that I'm talking about that would build efficiencies into these systems. And you'd be surprised how often I look at organizations as an outsider and I take this approach, and suddenly I realize all of this stuff that they're doing, that doesn't make any sense. That they could be. I mean, it makes sense, but it could be so much more efficient, and it could be so much better for the organization. They may even save a lot of money, for example, if they're consolidating. I'll give you an example from my industry. I work in healthcare, and one of the examples in healthcare that's happened lately, I work mostly in imaging informatics, which is, and you've probably heard me talk about images and radiology and so forth, and some of these other slide decks and presentations and topics in YouTube. But in hospitals, you have all these different departments, and for example, we have radiology, which radiology's core purpose is to take X-rays and CAT scans, and the deliverable of all of that is an image and a report about that image that the radiologist dictates, so the final report. But that's all image information that's generated by the radiology department. But then you also have the cardiology department, who, among all of the other things they do, they also produce images such as echocardiograms and nuclear medicine and things like that. Then you have gastroenterology, right? And one of all the things that they do endoscopies, which is throat down. They do colonoscopy, which is the other way. But all of that generates images. You're probably starting to see a bit of a theme here, right? All these different departments generate images. And, in a lot of hospitals, each one of those departments has their own little information system for managing those images, for storing and retrieving and interpreting those images. They're completely different systems. But wouldn't it make sense if all of those systems were on one unified platform? If all of those systems were one information system, so we can realize the efficiencies of using those systems? And that's what information systems professionals in recent years have identified. They've said, wait a minute, all these departments, they're all doing the same thing. They all have this common functional requirement. Why don't we implement one information system that can consolidate and make more efficient that particular area? And so, in fact, that's what's happening in hospitals. There's this concept called vendor-neutral archiving, where they basically create one large archive for all of their medical images throughout the entire enterprise. And what's really interesting about this is now doctors get a whole new context when they're looking at their electronic medical record systems, because now a radiologist that's looking at a CAT scan of an abdomen also has access to look at the patient's colonoscopy images, right? And now that brings a whole new world of interpretation to that data, because now you're looking at these two different modalities of study together, and it can bring certainly a lot of color to that to that black and white CAT scan. So kind of interesting how that's happening in healthcare. So again, we're going to do all of this stuff. The whole idea here is we're trying to make an overarching and discover projects that are going to bring value to the organization. So most information systems have various components, or our plan rather, our information system plan is going to have various components. So you have the organization, mission, objectives, and strategy, which I talked about in the beginning. Information inventory, which is an inventory of all the processes, functions, data, entities, and information needs of the entire enterprise. We already talked about mission and objectives. We have constraints on IS development, which could be imposed by technology, by financial or technical, right? So, there might be a limited budget to implement technology. There could be limited personnel that can do this. You might not have personnel that understand all these technologies, right? So that could certainly be a constraint. System needs an IS strategy, and then short-term plan, as well as your conclusions. And that's basically the components of a information systems plan. Now, finally, in this slide deck, I just want to, in this particular slide deck, I'm going to continue on with this topic in the next one, where we're going to talk about project selection. So we're going to talk about doing our analysis on choosing the right project once we decide on a project. But before I get there, one little topic that kind of pops up in this chapter of modern systems analysis and design is the different types of e-commerce, which we'll touch on later on. But I think it's important for us all to understand electronic commerce delivery. And there's three three different models for e-commerce. So the one that most of us are familiar with is where the individual and the business have a relationship through e-commerce, and that is business to consumer, right? So business to consumer is model number one. That's where a business is selling to a consumer. And then you have business to business on the other side, which is where a business is selling to another business, right? You can have other types as well, right? They can flip this around. You could have, so for business and individual, you could have individuals selling to business. So this would be things like platforms that allow individuals to sell their services to business. Like let's say a business wants to hire somebody to develop a website. They can go on they could go to some site and find a freelancer that they can hire to do something. That would be individual selling to business, or an individual that's a photographer that posts it on a website, and then businesses can purchase those photographs. The line's a little blurry here because that could be considered business to business, but the idea is that it's an individual selling to the business. And then you have individual to individual, things like Craigslist or eBay, right? So that's another market. But the big ones are business to business and business to consumer. And between those two, if I asked you which one of those is larger, a lot of students would tell me business to consumer is the biggest one. And the reason a lot of people think about that is because business to business is not really visible to you and I. But dollar for dollar, business to business e-commerce is much larger than business to consumer. And if you think about that, it makes sense because for every single thing that you buy from Amazon, right? So you go on Amazon.com and you buy something. In order for Amazon to get those products, they're buying it from another business. They're not manufacturing that stuff, right? So they're also buying stuff from someone, which means that for every transaction that you do on Amazon.com, there is a transaction between them and someone else, and there is money being exchanged on that side as well. And if they're buying something from their supplier in their supply chain has business to business up the supply chain to someone else. Us as consumers are all the way at the end of that supply chain. Think about all the other people going upstream in the supply chain with which there's business to business. So there's a tremendous amount of transactions that happen beyond just the consumer with the seller. So I just wanted to talk about that briefly so we all understand a little bit about these different e-commerce business models. All right, so that's I should probably pause here for a second. When we talk about, one of the things your book talks about is electronic data interchange. If you're following along in Modern Systems Analysis and Design, 8th edition by Balichik and George, this is one of the things I think kind of dates that textbook is, they talk about these older standards like EDI. EDI is basically, if you're not familiar with it, it's sort of an ASCII-based flat file type of data interchange format. I work in healthcare, and we use something called HL7, which is arguably almost the same as EDI in how it works. But EDI is sort of morphed over the last 30 years into an XML-based type of standard. And in fact, we're seeing more and more SOAP-based APIs or RESTful web interfaces to do information exchange between businesses. So, EDI might still be common in things like in healthcare. I think we still use it for billing, although I don't work in that side of healthcare. We still see it in manufacturing. I think there's still EDI, but a lot of modern information systems are transitioning or have already transitioned in the last 20 years to more XML-based standards. XML came out in the 90s. That's when XML started getting popular back in the 90s. and it's a much better system for exchanging information than something like EDI. I don't want to get into that too much in a class like this. We're going to talk about that, I think, in a little bit later in this topic. We'll talk about it. But again, I just want to mention that's what they're talking about with EDI. All right, so we talked in this slide deck, we talked about describing project identification and selection. Then I talked about corporate strategic planning and information system planning process. And then I talked about e-commerce at the very end, just so we have a basic understanding of different types of e-commerce. Now, in this particular topic, this subtopic that we're talking about, I do have one more slide deck in this area that we're talking about in planning, where I'm going to talk about doing our feasibility planning and project selection in once we've, our alternative selections. So be sure to take a look at that slide deck as well.